It started with a single message. Did you get home safely that night? Simple, polite, nothing wrong on the surface. I stared at it longer than I should have before replying. Yes. Thank you again. That should have been the end of it. But it wasn't. A few days later, he messaged again, this time sharing a photo of the sky outside his office. Gray clouds like the night he drove me home. Looks like rain again, he wrote. I replied with a smiling emoji, pretending it meant nothing, but deep down I knew something was changing. It became a pattern. Little exchanges that grew into conversations about everything and nothing. He asked about my day, about my old hobbies, about books I said I liked years ago. He remembered details Hassan had forgotten. I began waiting for his messages the way I once waited for my husband's. It wasn't about attraction yet, not exactly, it was about attention. A quiet warmth that started filling the spaces where silence had lived for too long. 81st, I tried to convince myself that it was innocent. We were friends, that was all. Saad was simply kind, someone who listened without judgment. But even kindness can become dangerous when it starts meaning more than it should. I found myself checking my phone while cooking, smiling at texts I couldn't explain. Hassan would ask what I was laughing at, and I'd say, just something online. A small lie, harmless, yet heavy. Hassan was still the same, loving, distracted, tired. Our conversations revolved around bills, meals, and his deadlines. Every evening, I'd sit with him at dinner, nodding along, pretending I wasn't somewhere else in my mind. There were moments when guilt would creep in, sharp and fleeting, but I'd silence it quickly. I wasn't doing anything wrong, I'd remind myself. I wasn't meeting him, I wasn't hiding in dark corners. I was just talking. Then came the day he asked if I'd finished my painting. I told him I hadn't even started. He sent a picture of a half-done sketch from his desk, saying, I tried something after our talk that night. It was messy but beautiful, like a reflection of the chaos we were both quietly feeding. I stared at that sketch for a long time before typing back, You're better than you think. He replied, Maybe you inspire me. I didn't know how to answer that. Days turned into weeks. Sometimes we'd talk late into the night about things we'd never confessed to anyone else, how tired we were of pretending, how easy it was to be misunderstood by the people closest to us. He told me he hadn't felt connected to anyone in years. I didn't say it, but I understood him completely. There's a kind of loneliness that grows quietly between routine and responsibility, and when someone notices it, the relief feels dangerously close to love. The first time I felt real fear was when Hassan mentioned inviting Saad for dinner. My heart skipped a beat. I smiled, pretending enthusiasm, but inside I panicked. The thought of the three of us sharing a table felt unbearable. When Saad arrived that evening, everything in me tensed. He was polite, respectful, and distant. He barely looked at me, as if our messages didn't exist. That restraint only deepened the pull. The more he avoided me, the more my thoughts tangled around him. After he left, Hassan said, He's a good guy. Reminds me of when I was younger. I smiled faintly and nodded, but the words stung. Saad wasn't just a colleague anymore, He had become a mirror showing me everything missing from my marriage. Our messages continued, but now with careful pauses. He disappeared for days, then returned with something simple. You were quiet last time. Each message felt like a spark I tried to smother, yet secretly missed when it was gone. Guilt began to settle like dust, soft, constant, impossible to clean completely. Then came the night everything changed. Hassan was away on a business trip. The house was silent except for the ticking clock. I was scrolling through my phone when his message appeared. Sometimes, I wish you weren't married. I froze. My chest tightened, not from shock, but from recognition. Because a part of me had been waiting for those words. I didn't reply. I put the phone face down, but I couldn't move. It was as if he'd voiced something I'd already thought but never dared to admit. That I sat there for a long time, staring at the darkness. Every conversation, every shared thought had led to this. We hadn't touched, hadn't even stood too close, but the boundary had already been crossed in silence. I knew it, and so did he. I thought about Hassan, his familiar scent, his tired eyes, his trust. The guilt pressed harder, but still, I didn't delete the chat. I couldn't. The next morning, Saad didn't text, and neither did I. The silence between us was louder than any words we'd shared. I went through my day pretending nothing had changed, but inside, I felt something collapse, a mix of shame and longing that refused to fade. I kept telling myself I'd stop, that I'd draw a line. But deep down, I knew the truth. The moment I started waiting for his messages more than my husband's, I'd already crossed it. That night, as I lay beside Hassan, who had just returned and was peacefully asleep, I whispered to myself the truth I couldn't say aloud. I hadn't betrayed him with my body, but my heart had already chosen its silence.
He began to speak less and observe more. The silence between us became charged, not with resentment this time, but with expectation. Every small thing I did seemed to hold a new kind of meaning to him. I could feel his eyes on me as I moved around the house, reading gestures I didn't intend to send. It was like living inside an experiment I didn't agree to but somehow couldn't step out of. A week later, he told me he wanted to take a break from the routine, no explanations, just space. I didn't argue. Maybe I even welcomed it. The quiet at home without him was different, not lonely, just weightless. I could think without being watched. But I also found myself missing the tension, the strange pulse he had brought into my life. That was when Ethan appeared. He was someone from work, someone who had always been friendly but nothing more. But when you start to question the foundation of everything you've built, even casual kindness can feel like invitation. He asked if I wanted to grab coffee after work. I said yes before I could think about what I was agreeing to. It wasn't attraction that drove me, it was curiosity, the same kind Daniel had awakened in me. The conversation with Ethan was easy, maybe too easy. He noticed the small things, like the ring I kept twisting on my finger or the pauses when I spoke about my marriage. I didn't talk much about Daniel, but when I did, Ethan listened with quiet understanding instead of judgment. That felt dangerous, because when someone listens that way, you start saying more than you should. I told myself it was just coffee. But it wasn't. It was validation. It was proof that I could still make someone curious. When I went home, Daniel was there, waiting. He didn't ask where I'd been, and that silence said more than any confrontation could. I wanted him to ask. I wanted him to demand answers, to give me a reason to draw a line again. But he just smiled, that same detached smile, and said, "You seem alive today." The way he said it made me feel both guilty and powerful. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the look in his eyes, not suspicion, but approval. It made me realize something painful. He wanted this. Not for revenge, not for lust, but for control. He wanted to see how far I could go once he removed the limits. It was twisted, but I understood it. Part of me even shared it. Over the next few days, I kept seeing Ethan. Nothing about it was planned. It just kept happening, brief moments, short exchanges, an orbit we couldn't seem to break. I told myself each time that it would be the last, but Daniel's silence kept feeding it. He never asked, never accused, never tried to stop me. His indifference became permission. One night, when I came home later than usual, Daniel was on the couch. He looked at me as I set my keys down, and there was no anger in his eyes, just a quiet kind of triumph. "You've done it, haven't you?" he asked softly. My throat went dry. I didn't answer. He didn't need me to. His face was unreadable, part relief, part sadness, part satisfaction. "Good," he said after a pause. "Now we can be honest." That word again, honest. It had lost all meaning by then. He had turned honesty into something transactional, a test of loyalty disguised as liberation. I wanted to hate him for it, but I couldn't. Because somewhere along the way, I had stopped being innocent in the game we were playing. I told him I didn't want to talk about it, but he insisted. He said he needed to understand what I felt, not what I did. That made me realize this wasn't about betrayal, it was about knowledge. He wanted to see me through someone else's eyes, to dissect my desire like a scientist studying a reaction. I asked him why it mattered. He said, because maybe that's the only way we find out what's still real between us. For days after that, I couldn't decide who was more at fault. Him, for pushing me there, or me, for not resisting. The guilt didn't come immediately, it arrived slowly, like a shadow that stretches longer as the day fades. I started avoiding Ethan, not because I didn't want him, but because I couldn't face what he represented anymore. He had become proof, and I didn't want proof of anything. Daniel's behavior changed again. He became gentler, almost tender. He would brush my hair back, touch my hand, and look at me like he finally understood something. But I didn't feel peace in his touch, I felt exposure. It was as if he could see every thought I had, every choice I made. His forgiveness wasn't mercy, it was ownership. One night, he said quietly, "You think this broke us, but maybe it saved us." I couldn't answer. The words made no sense, yet part of me wanted to believe them. Maybe he needed to destroy what we had to rebuild it on truth. Or maybe he just wanted to know I could fall and still come back, but something inside me had shifted permanently. I couldn't see him as I once did. The line between love and manipulation had blurred beyond recognition. Even in our quiet moments, I could feel the ghost of what had happened between us, sitting silently at the table, reminding us that some truths don't heal, they just change shape. That was when I realized what Daniel had really wanted wasn't honesty. It was control over the truth itself. And I had given it to him, without even noticing when. In the weeks that followed, the house felt heavier than before, not from arguments or tension but from silence that said everything. Daniel and I moved around each other like actors who had forgotten their lines but were too proud to admit it. I thought that after his so-called experiment, we'd talk, rebuild, redefine. Instead, he retreated into himself, satisfied in a way that scared me. It was as if he had proven something to himself and didn't need me for the conclusion. I tried to resume normal routines, cooking, work, conversations that skimmed the surface, but nothing landed where it used to. Every small action reminded me of what had changed. There was a time I could read his moods, now I couldn't even tell if he loved me or if he was just fascinated by the wreckage we'd become. The trust we had wasn't broken in an explosive moment, it had simply eroded, grain by grain, until there was nothing solid left to stand on. Sometimes he would look at me across the table, eyes calm, voice even, and ask how I was feeling. I hated that question. Not because of the words but because he sounded like a therapist rather than a husband. I began to wonder if I'd ever really known him or if he had been performing a version of love that fit his curiosity. It was a dangerous thought, one that made me feel both guilty and strangely free. One night, after another wordless dinner, I asked him directly if he still loved me. He hesitated, then said, "I don't know what that word means anymore." I think that was the first honest thing either of us had said in months. I felt something inside me unclench, not relief exactly, but clarity. If love had become an experiment for him, maybe it was time I stopped being the subject of it. In the days that followed, I began to reclaim small pieces of myself. I started waking up early, walking before dawn, feeling the quiet air that didn't belong to anyone else. I stopped waiting for him to react. I stopped measuring my worth through his approval or his silence. The strange thing was, he didn't fight it. He let me drift away, almost peacefully, as if this too was part of his design. Eventually, I confronted him again, not with anger, but with exhaustion. I told him that what we'd done had turned our marriage into something unrecognizable. I said I couldn't live under his microscope anymore, and I didn't care if he called that selfish. He listened quietly, then said, maybe that was the point. Maybe you needed to see what happens when you stop pretending. His words might have been intended as wisdom, but they felt cruel. I realized then that his version of truth was just another form of control, cold, calculated, and empty. That night, I packed a small bag. He didn't stop me. He just stood by the doorway, hands in his pockets, expression unreadable. As I walked out, he said, "You'll come back when you understand." I didn't answer. I didn't even look back. The air outside felt like a different world, unsteady but real. For the first time in years, I was making a choice that didn't need his permission. Living alone was harder than I imagined. The quiet wasn't peaceful, it was accusatory. There were nights I replayed everything in my head, wondering when exactly love had turned into a test. I tried to pinpoint the moment I stopped recognizing the person I'd become. But memory is a tricky thing, it edits itself until even guilt starts to sound like justification. I wanted to believe I was the victim, but deep down I knew we both were architects of what happened. Months passed before I heard from him again. He sent a short message, "I hope you found what you were looking for." I stared at it for a long time before deleting it without replying. Because the truth was, I hadn't found anything. I hadn't healed, or moved on, or discovered a new version of myself that made the pain worth it. What I had found was silence, the kind that doesn't suffocate but reminds you of who you used to be before everything got complicated. Sometimes, late at night, I still think about that first conversation, the moment he asked if I ever thought about being with someone else. If I could go back, I'd tell him the truth, that I didn't think about it until he made me. That curiosity can be poison when disguised as honesty. And that once you open a door like that, you don't just walk through it, you leave parts of yourself behind that never come back. I see now that what he called honesty was never about love. It was about control, about breaking something to see what it's made of. And maybe that's what love does when it stops being tender, it turns into dissection. I wasn't innocent, but I wasn't cruel either. I was just someone who wanted to feel alive, and I mistook destruction for freedom. When people ask why our marriage ended, I tell them it was because we told the truth. They usually look confused, maybe thinking I'm being poetic. But I'm not. The truth is what ended it. Because sometimes, when you dig deep enough to find what's real, you realize it's not love holding you together, it's the fear of what happens when you let go. And so, I did. I let go. I never saw him again, but I still carry the lesson he forced on me, that love built on curiosity instead of compassion is doomed to collapse. That some truths should never be tested. And that once a heart is treated like an experiment, it stops being capable of wonder. In the end, he got what he wanted. He understood me, just not the way he imagined. He saw what happens when you push someone to their breaking point and call it honesty. And I learned that even in betrayal, the hardest person to forgive isn't the one who hurt you, it's the version of yourself that let it happen.